Welcome back to our series on the Western painting canon. In the first episode of this series, we saw how Florence gave the Renaissance its great visual language, how it gave it structure, through Brunelleschi's dome, through Donatello's great sculptural figures, through the enormous bronze doors of Ghiberti in the Florentine baptistry, and through Masaccio's perspective, and how the world that gave rise to all of these artistic endeavors was a world that put great emphasis on proportion, on civic culture, and had a great confidence in human intelligence. But Venice, on the other hand, gives us a different tradition, a different Renaissance painting tradition. If Florence is drawing, then Venice is color. If Florence is stone and structure, then Venice is water and reflection. Florence takes form and gives it life through line. Venice, on the other hand, takes those forms and lets it shimmer, it lets it soften and dissolve in the light reflected by the waters of the Venetian lagoon. And this artistic, almost spiritual contrast between the Florentine and Tuscan traditions and the Venetian tradition is defined by the contrast between disegno and colorito, essentially between drawing and color. The Tuscan tradition, the tradition of disegno, is focused in line, atmosphere, and structure. But the Venetian tradition, the tradition of colorito, puts far greater emphasis on reflection, on atmosphere, on pleasure, and poetry. And the reason why Venice paints differently is because the city itself invites the painter to do so. The famous blue waters of the lagoon, the famous glass, the light that hits this floating city every day, it invites the painter to think in these abstract and dreamlike terms. And even Vasari, the man who wrote the lives of the artists, from where we drew so many of our anecdotes and stories in the previous episode, for him, the true Renaissance tradition was about line and structure, not about colorito. In the first edition of his Lives of the Artists, he barely mentions any Venetian painters. In later editions, he amended this, but for him, the bias remained. The Renaissance is about disegno. But to truly understand why Venice paints differently, we have to understand the city and its history. Venice is an impossible city. It's built in a place where no city should ever have been built. And the reason for this is that as the old Roman world cracked, as Goths, Vandals, Huns, and eventually the Lombards invaded the Italian peninsula, the people of the Veneto region had to flee the area, and they didn't flee to a grand capital with massive walls and fortifications. They fled to a series of mud-ridden islands in the Adriatic. And this is part of the Venetian myth, the idea that survival, difficulty, escape built their beautiful, glittering city, a sort of Dubai of its time. But the Venetians didn't necessarily think of themselves as something new. They thought of themselves as successors to the old Roman world, because they were the only part of Italy that hadn't been completely overrun by barbarians. And so they looked towards Byzantium, even though they were part of the Italian mainland. And nominally, they owed loyalty to the Eastern Roman Emperor, to Byzantium, but in practice, they were effectively an independent maritime republic, ruled by councils, by merchants, and of course by their famous elected Doge. And this was the Venetian duality, the fact that they were both Byzantine and Latin, that they were republican and aristocratic. And the Venetian aristocracy was not the traditional aristocracy of castles, fields, and peasants. Venice didn't have any land, so Venice was ruled by a class of patrician merchants who understood commerce, who understood contracts, who understood cargo. And they served the Venetian state as ambassadors, for example. Venice was known for its highly sophisticated diplomatic network, as well as its huge spy network that stretched all the way from Lisbon to Moscow. In some ways, Venice was ruled by these old men in velvet who preferred to spend their day in council halls and canal houses to castles and country homes. But they were the men who ensured that the Venetian Republic, the Venetian state, lasted not for 200, not for 300, but for 1,000 years. And in later times, they would be portrayed as obsessed with luxury, as eccentric, as decadent. But the fact is that they were the brain of the Venetian Republic. The lagoon may have been the body that prevented invaders such as the Franks, under Pepin from taking over the Republic, but the patrician classes of Venice, the aristocracy of Venice, was the brain that ensured its survival. But the muscle of the Venetian state was the Venetian navy. Now, the arsenal of Venice could produce, at its height, one ship every day, and it was the navy that ensured that Venice's commercial sea routes were safe, that Venice could play with Murano glass, that it could develop its printing press industry, that it could read Aldine books, and Venice became this shimmering city of ambassadors, of spies, of councils, and carnival, because the foundation was strong, because it had a strong navy. Venice called itself La Serenissima, the most serene republic, and at the center of that serene performance stood the cornetto hat-wearing Doge, who once elected was forced to serve the Venetian Republic for life from the luxurious rooms of the Palazzo Ducale. And he in many ways was the living mask of the Republic, the figure through whom Venice staged itself. So when the Doge stood before the Adriatic each year and performed the marriage of the sea ceremony, casting a ring into the water, this was not just a ceremony, a ritual. It was Venice telling the world what it believed itself to be. It declared itself to be in eternal communion with the sea. It was married to the sea. Venice's destiny was made through the sea, through diplomacy, through commerce, but also through theft. In 828 AD, a group of Venetian merchants stole the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria. Now, according to legend, St. Mark had been told by an angel that his final resting place would be Venice, and the Venetians made sure that happened. And the way they did this is that, with the help of the local priests, they wrapped the body of St. Mark in pig fat, so that when they left Alexandria, the Muslim customs officials would not really care to look at their baggage because they would be disgusted by the pig fat. And in this way, Venice got its patron saint, St. Mark. And St. Mark was laid to rest in the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice, which is truly Venice's autobiography because it is both Byzantine and Latin. It is sacred and stolen. Venice's hunger kept increasing. During the Fourth Crusade, Venice had agreed to transport the Crusaders across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land, but the Crusaders weren't able to pay the amount they had agreed to, so in exchange, the old Doge, who was blind, Enrico Dandolo, basically in exchange asked the Crusaders to raise the city of Zadar, which had been under Venetian control but had subjected itself to the Hungarian king. Now, this represented a risk to Venetian commercial interests in the Adriatic. So the Crusaders raised Zadar, they put Zadar back into Venetian control, and eventually they went to Constantinople, where the Doge himself, who was 96, 97 years old, apart from being old and blind, personally unfurled the flag of St. Mark and raised the great Byzantine capital. And Venice was able to get an enormous amount of loot, including the hippodrome, which would later be placed in the Basilica of St. Mark. From a maritime republic, Venice became a maritime empire, a Stato da Mar of islands, ports, and colonies across the eastern Mediterranean. Crete, Cyprus, Dalmatia, the Aegean. Venice was not just a city now, it was a floating empire in many ways. Genoa was its great rival. Marco Polo gave it an eastern horizon, and even our word quarantine comes from this Venetian world of commerce, ships, and empire. From the 40 days vessels could be held before entering the city if they were suspected of carrying any disease. But as sea power became harder to sustain, especially after the Portuguese discoveries and the rise of the Atlantic empires, Venice also turned inland, building a terraferma state on the Italian mainland and drawing itself deeper into Italian politics and war. So yes, Venice is beautiful but not innocent. It is in many ways splendor with claws. And even its practical problems shaped its art. The damp Venetian climate made fresco less reliable. So Venice became a great city of canvas painting. Its squale, the confraternities, part religious, part civic, part social, competed for prestige and filled their halls with vast narrative cycles. And from this world of color, trade, empire, ceremony, display, we arrive to the Venetian language of color and the great painters of the 16th century.